Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week we have a very special episode. By the overall episode count, if not the total podcasts I've actually done, because there's several more than this marks the 400th episode of the show. That's 400 episodes since the show first debuted on June 17, 2015, nearly 8 years ago, as writer-artist Sean Gordon Murphy joined me for a conversation about the business of comics, and it just kept building from there. This week's episode is going to be a bit different because of that big round number. If comics have taught me anything, it's that when you hit a number divisible by 100, you have to do something big, or at the very least, different. So that's what we're going to do here. This week's episode will be a call-in show for which patrons of the podcast, friends of the show, and celebrated peers shared audio questions for me to answer on this celebratory occasion. That's right. For this one episode only, the listeners of Off Panel will become the hosts, and I will become the guest. I want to do that for two reasons. One, it sounded like a lot of fun, even if I will fully admit it is way easier to host a podcast than guest on one. I don't know what it is, but it just totally throws me off my game, and probably everyone off their game, to have to answer questions on the fly, but that's what I want to do, so we're going to do it. Two, it flips the script, and the focus is on the listeners of the show, which is important to me because without you all, I would not be doing this still. To be honest, the earliest thoughts I had in the pre-podcast days were that I really thought the name Off Panel would be a good name, and that I liked doing interviews. Before I got started this, I had absolutely no idea how to do a podcast. The first episode I recorded was in a wide open room in my then apartment with no microphone or headphones. I'd like to say I know a little bit more about it now, but that's in the eye of the beholder. I can tell you this though, I never expected to make it this far. 400 episodes is insane to me. Then would have been absolutely bonkers. It's because the support of the listeners, the generosity of the guests, and the generally incredible nature of the folks who support Off Panel on Patreon that I'm still doing this. 400 episodes in, Off Panel remains a generally one-person show, save for semi-regular edits from the great Deanna Chapman and the kindness of musical artists like Wolfpack, Upright T-Rex Music, and Yola Tango, who have been nice enough to let me use their music as the show's theme songs over the years. But it's always felt like a team effort because of all of you. So needless to say, thanks to you all. You're the best, and Off Panel number 400 would not be here without you. But that's enough intro. I don't like podcasts that do lengthy intros. It's not my thing. They're fine, but it's just not my thing. Let's get to the questions, which we'll do in order of receipt, starting with one from an off-panel all-star who is undoubtedly in the top 5 for most guest appearances. Let's get to it.
This is Patrick Brower from Challengers Comics and Conversation in Chicago, and my question to you, David, is, do you still have the desire to open your own store, to be a comic book retailer yourself? With all of your discussions with comic retailers over the past 400 episodes, has that desire grown or waned, especially with the changes in the industry? Do you still want to open a store? And if so, why? Haven't we done enough to dissuade you? Congratulations on 400 episodes, and here's to 400 more.
I just want to start by saying that Patrick's saying, why haven't we done enough to dissuade you, actually made me laugh out loud as I was listening to it. So good job by you, Patrick. To answer Patrick's question, do I still have that desire to open my own comic book shop? So for listeners that don't know, which maybe a lot of you, because I haven't talked about it as much as I used to, but my goal in comics has never been to make comics. I have absolutely no interest in making comics. I don't know why. It's probably because I'm bad at art, and that's like the main thing I wanted to do. But my number one goal, if I wanted to have a job in comics, was to open my own comic shop because I love comic shops. Comic shops have always been my headquarters. It's where I grew up at. It's just, I don't know. They're magical. I still remember being a little kid just sitting in the middle. I was like the kid that sat on the floor at comic shops, reading X-Men, just living and dying as every page turned. And I was probably that annoying little kid, but it was a huge foundational element of my love of them. And I've always wanted to open my own comic shop because of that. And beyond that, as much as I love my local comic book shop, Bosco's, I always felt like Anchorage, Alaska had a real opportunity for a different type of comic shop that was more, graphic novel oriented, more oriented on readers outside the typical Wednesday Warriors, and just kind of more oriented on my vibe, if that makes sense. Long story short, I am still interested in opening my own comic shop, but The problem is Anchorage, Alaska has become not the best place economically, and I don't know if it could sustain multiple comic shops. As somebody who opened a comic shop in a town roughly 50 miles away learned as of late, they're doing fine, but it's a little bit harder than I think they expected. And so because of that, I've been a little conscientious about that, and, I'm waiting to pick my spot. Am I going to wait to pick my spot until the direct market no longer exists? I don't know, but I will say this. My wife and I still talk about it a lot. We actually, after our trip to France, where we visited a couple cat cafes because we missed our cats and we wanted to go to a cat cafe, which we've never done before, we have decided that not only will this be a comic shop, but it will also be a comics, coffee, and cats comic shop. So that will be a whole thing. I don't know how we're going to make it work, but we did go to a bookstore in Aix-en-Provence in France called Monchat Pitra, in which there was like dozens, or like, let's say 11 cats there. And the bookstore operated really well around that. And we think we can make it a whole thing. Also, my wife has this idea for baking infinity scones as one of the things we would have in the coffee shop area. Please do not take that idea. It's too good. Anyways, so long story short, yes, I do still want to be a comic book retailer. I think I could do a very good job of it, just like Patrick does, just like many of the guests who have come on the show that are retailers do. And I would like to make it happen. Will I? That's an entirely different story. I'll let you know when I do, though, because I probably will stop off panel and sketch when I do that, because I hear being a comic book retailer is a lot of work.
Hi, David. Mark Abnett here. Congratulations on reaching the 400 episode milestone. It's a testament to your work ethic and passion. And thanks for all your hard work. Question time. What is something that immediately takes you out of the reading experience? The one thing that ruins it for you, and what creative teams should absolutely look out for? And for your Stilt-Man Prestige series, what's your elevator pitch, and what is Wilbur Day's motivation that sets him apart from other Marvel characters? Thanks again, and looking forward to another 400 episodes. Cheers.
I really appreciate Mark bringing in the Stilt-Man into all of this, because this podcast, Off Panel number 400, would not be complete without my guy Stilty. So thanks, Mark, for that. We'll start there. We'll start with the Stilt-Man question. So the long-running thing that I've always said is, if I did write a comic, it would be a Stilt-Man Prestige series. And as you may know, I love Stilt-Man. Stilt-Man's great. One of the things that I really love about him, and the reason why I want to make a Prestige series of the character, or at least I would like to be involved with a Prestige series about the character, is I find the character's legacy to be fascinating. Let's be honest, Stilt-Man is an objectively stupid idea. It is a very bad idea to attach very long legs to your body and use that to commit crimes because, well, any number of reasons, but most of them are very obvious. I don't feel like I need to explain to you why Stilt-Man is a bad idea conceptually. However, what is very fascinating to me is that Stilt-Man isn't just one person, Wilbur Day, the first guy who stole the suit and used it to vacuum people's like jewelry and stuff off of the rooftop party in Daredevil number 8 when he debuted. It has become a legacy of, I think like 5 or 6 total characters who have worn the stilts. There's been a Lady Stilt-Man. Turk stole it for a day and wore it in Daredevil. There's been a bunch of different versions of this character. And all of them saw this situation, these stilts, this objectively bad idea, and were like, this is a good idea. What I think would be a lot of fun would be like a comic that merges the energy of Superior Foes of Spider-Man, the Nick Spencer and Steve Lieber series that absolutely ruled, the real look at the gritty D-list characters who are hanging out and just grinding out a living as supervillains, mixed with Spider-Man life story, the Chip Zdarsky and Mark Bagley series that looked at Spider-Man's life throughout the entirety of his existence, if it actually played out over time. Now, we wouldn't do the time thing, but what each issue would be is they would focus on a different Stilt-Man and what it means to be Stilt-Man and the motivation behind these characters and what their lives are really like. Because I actually think that there's a really fascinating look at the grinders of the world. there's like a certain class of villain in Marvel that isn't like the Doctor Doom. They don't run a country. They don't have a ton of money. They aren't really making a major difference in the world. They're just like a minor inconvenience in the life of everyone. And I would love to like dig into what that means and like what it takes to be a Stilt-Man. I think that'd be a lot of fun. So that's my pitch. Let's see. In regards to the first question is, what is something that takes me out of the reading experience? This is very hard to distinguish, and it's very much in the eye of the beholder. But I think my answer to that would be, on the rare occasion I come across lettering that is very, I don't know, it just bristles against you and it just doesn't feel right. There's some times where you come across lettering where it's like a weird letter choice, or it's just something that just is subpar. You know, sometimes you try to like save some money in the production of a book and you end up not spending a lot on a letter, and it takes readers out of the experience. That is certainly the case for me. So if there's any great advice I can give to anyone that's trying to make a good comic, make sure that you do not go light on paying your letterers, because having a real professional who can bring some artistry to it and clarity to the read makes a major difference in whether or not these comics really work. And yeah, there's a reason why the best letters are really good and on every book, and it's because they make a major difference.
Hey, David, it's Nick Bennett down in Albuquerque, and my question is relating to your recent trip to France. Me and my wife went for our honeymoon back in 2017 for almost like 3 weeks and had a wonderful time. So my question is, did you guys go to any museums when you were there in Paris or anything like that? And was there any particular piece of art that may have struck you or that you really enjoyed? Cool. Thanks, man.
Okay, for this one, I'm going to have to bring in a special guest. I'm going to bring in my wife, Amber. Amber, say hello.
Hello.
So the question was about our trip to France and the museums we went to and our favorite things we saw in terms of exhibits. Now, here's one of the funny things. We actually really didn't go to that many museums. In your mind, Amber, how many museums did we go to?
2.
2. What were the 2 museums?
The Arts Decoratifs.
Arts Decoratifs.
And there was a very strange one in Lyon that we went to. It was a museum of miniatures.
Yeah, like it had like film props and it had miniatures, like the little dioramas people would make and stuff like that. It was a very strange museum. You could say that we went to a lot more because we went to like the Papal Palace in Avignon, and we went to a chateau tour that had like museum-like elements, but really the only 2 actual museums we went to were Arts Decoratifs, which was recommended by the team at Humanoids, and the Miniatures Museum, which was recommended by, I don't even remember. It was a strange museum.
I think it was something we just came across, and then we saw a flyer for it, and it was just so weird. We were like, we gotta go check this out.
Yeah, and it had on the flyer, it had Thrawn from Star Wars, so I was really hyped because I was reading Thrawn books at that point, and we were about to go to the Paris Fan Festival, and I was going to meet the writer Timothy Zahn, who created Thrawn, so I was like, I gotta go to this place. It had nothing about Thrawn, but to answer the question, Amber, was there a standout museum from those experiences?
Yeah, what stands out to me is that Arts Decoratifs, we stumbled across an exhibit about hair through the ages, which was really odd, but really wonderful. And as you kept walking through it, it kept getting stranger and stranger and more modern, because it started about the 1700s or so, talking about wigs and hair additions, but then it got into like weird runway, fashion hair that was like looking like a bear attacking on like a woman's head. It was very strange.
And then like when designers like Alexander McQueen would make coats out of wigs and things like that. But also it would show like things about our relationship with hair and how that's evolved over the years, about how like there used to be, it's like, you don't have facial hair because that's wrong. And then it's like, you do have facial hair because it's amazing. And then like weird commercials about things that I don't really want to get into, but let's just say that they were intense and hilarious and we loved them. But it was a spectacular exhibit. The entire Arts Decoratifs Museum was great. I mean, the 80s exhibit was great too. Yeah,
that was really, really great too.
And the reason why we went was actually because the Humanoids team recommended this Etienne Robayal exhibit that was more about a comic adjacent person who did work for like Metal Hurlant and things like that. But really, the standout exhibit was the hair, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it really was. I mean, there was even, Victorian times when people would make hair jewelry. People would take the hair of their family and like make bracelets or, watch bands out of it. I mean, it was weird. It was really weird.
It's funny that you'd probably think our answer would be like, oh, we went to the Louvre and we saw like the Mona Lisa or something like that. But the weird thing is museums were not really high on our list because Amber and I have been to a lot of museums. I've been to the Louvre. I've been to other museums in France. I'd never heard of Arts Décoratifs. We decided to go there with a friend of mine, and we all agreed that it was like one of the most fun and original museums we'd ever been to.
I totally agree. And then we had Mexican food after that, which was fantastic.
It was a very classic Parisian day. But yeah, amazing trip. If you get a chance, go to Arts Décoratifs and then go to the taco joint that's nearby. Actual tacos, not French tacos. So yeah, that's our take.
Hey, David. Cartoonist and longtime listener Ben Becker here to ask you something that I'm kind of curious about. As a person in comics with a well-regarded platform, what responsibility do you feel, if any, to portray the comics community at large holistically, positively, and honestly as an interviewer and journalist? And if I still have time, I just want to say a quick thank you to you, David, for all the work that you do. Your podcast has kept me company since I'm fairly certain since I was still in high school and now all the way through college and as a working adult, as a professional in the comics industry. So please keep being a welcome force in our special little world of comics. Thanks, David.
This is a really great question from Ben, but I have to admit, the first thing I have to comment on is the last part where you said that you've been listening since high school and you're now a working adult. That made me feel like that part in Saving Private Ryan where Matt Damon shifts from Matt Damon into an old man. I guess I have been doing this for a long time. Off Panel's been running for 8 years, but at the same time, I guess I never really thought about the fact that somebody would have changed or grown that much over that time period. But I'm very glad it's kept you company. Thank you for the kind words, Ben. In regards to your question, what responsibility do I feel to represent the comics community holistically, positively, and honestly? I'm going to take those word by word. Holistically, it's difficult. There's only so much capacity a single individual can have, and we are in a period where there are more comics than ever. And so to some degree, to cover comics, you must read comics. And given the fact that there are weekly comics from a wide variety of publishers, there are book market books that, are YA, middle grade, adult, kids, et cetera, et cetera. There's, webtoon, there's manga, there's all these different places that just didn't exist in comics before. There's really no way for a single individual to cover it all holistically. I try to do my best. I try to do cross sections of individual elements, like when I had Debe Oki on to talk about manga, or when I wrote about Webtoon for Sketched, or wrote about libraries for Sketched. I try to cover all of it to some degree. It's just really difficult to get everything. And I do my best, but it's something I think about a lot, and it's something that actually kind of, I feel bad about. I want to do a better job of it. I should do a better job of it, but to be honest, combined with my day job, it's just there's only so much capacity I can have, and there's only so much capacity any individual can have. In terms of, having a positive take on all this stuff, I try to be positive because I do this as a labor of love. At the same time, if I need to call something out or if I feel like there's a specific thing that could be better, I do that. I don't do it on the podcast as much because most of those are conversations about things that I really like. And so it's very rare that highly negative things come up. I know that some people really liked my Bad Idea interview that I did with Dinesh Shamdasani because I talked to him very specifically about some of the things that I thought didn't make sense for Bad Idea, and he rolled with it. I think most people in comics would roll with the negative things if you have to bring them up. It just doesn't come up as often on the podcast because of that. But I would say on Sketched, I'm a lot better at that part. But I think it's not about looking at things positively uniformly. I think it's more about taking the appropriate lens to the subject and saying what is necessary to be said. And I think I do an okay job of that. I could probably do better, but I would say I do okay on it. And lastly, what responsibility do I have to portray the comics community honestly? I think that goes with the positively part where it's like I do my best to try to provide my perspective on a certain thing. That's another thing that's important here is like, honestly, the quote unquote honestly is a difficult word because it's all relative. I could look at things and have a completely different perspective than say like Heidi MacDonald or Oliver Sava or I don't know, Milton Greep. we would all have different takes on the same subject. So honestly, really is a subjective thing. As long as I'm not just making stuff up, I'm being honest on a real level. But at the same time, I would like to say that I'm truthful to my own perspective, sometimes to the detriment of myself, given the fact that I constantly talk about Stilt-Man and Kaiju Max. But yeah, that's my take. I think that it's important to do those things, but I also think there can be limitations to those ideas just because of how big comics is.
Hey David, Vita here. On the auspicious occasion of your 400th episode of Off Panel, I have 2 questions for you. The first is, if you could experience reading one comic book again for the first time, which would you choose? So if you wiped your memory of the comic book and you read it again, which one would you want it to be? I know that's going to be a hard one for you because you read a lot of comic books. And second, as an experienced cat owner, if you could go back in time, what would you do differently? That's what I got for you. Thank you so much for everything that you do for the community. You really have been a light in these dark times, and congratulations on 400 episodes.
I am so glad that somebody asked about my cats, and I should have known it would be Vita because Vita's the best and also a fellow cat person. So yes, Vita, you rule. In terms of what I would do differently if I could go back in time as a experienced cat owner, well, first off, I just wish I knew more because everything was just guesswork to begin with. You can read a lot, but at the same time, having a living being around you that depends on you is not something that you know naturally very well. And I had never had a pet as an adult, and so it was a real learning curve. I would say the number one thing that I wish I was better at, one thing I would do differently is I kind of wish I was more present for my cats, if that makes sense. I have a lot of times, just because I'm doing comic stuff and I'm doing my day job and I'm doing all these other things where I'm multitasking, and I just, sometimes I look at my cats and I'm just like, I wish I just had more time to just spend with my cats. But then at the same time, they're also sleeping on me as I'm working, so I think they're getting what they want, and it's very nice for me as well, so I can't really complain. In terms of if I could wipe my memory of a comic book and read it again, what one would it be? This is a funny answer because it's one of the comics I would say that if I'm famous for not reading, it's probably the one I'm most famous for. It's Sandman, Neil Gaiman's Sandman. The reason why I say that as a comic I've never read is I did try reading it at one point. I read the beginning of the very first volume back in like 2006, 2007 or so. And when I read it, I just did not enjoy it. It was just not my thing. And I think it was because I was like 22 and I didn't really have a good feel for comics like that. And it was just very dense. And I think that if I read it again now for the first time without that idea in my head that maybe I wouldn't enjoy it, I think that I would tear it up and absolutely love it because near as I can tell, everyone loves Sandman. And for some reason, I'm this weirdo monster that just has never even read it. So that's my take. I would wipe my memory of the comic I've famously never read.
Hey, David, it's Jason Wood from 11 O'Clock Comics. First of all, huge congratulations on 400 episodes. Happy anniversary. As you know, I have been a big fan of your show really from the start. I think it is without question one of the industry's best. So keep it up. Now, you also know that in addition to being an avid podcaster myself and loving comics for 30 plus years, I am an ardent collector of original comic book art. And as a result, I think it's fair to say that my favorite creators of all time are writer-artists, those who write and draw their own work. So my question for you on your 400th anniversary Q&A episode is, who are the 3 writer-artists in comic history that mean the most to you? Congrats again, and here's to another 400 episodes.
I felt like I had a really good grasp on this until Jason said the ones that mean the most to you, because that makes it a bird of a wildly different feather. So I'm going to list off 6, 3 who are my actual favorites and 3 who were runners up. One of them I really wanted to put in the top 3 because he is one of the people who made me love comics and one of the people who I think is one of the greatest comic creators ever, Bill Watterson. Calvin and Hobbes is one of my favorite comics of all time. John Allison is another runner-up. John Allison is somebody whose work, particularly with Bad Machinery, is something that just very specifically speaks to my brain. I've described Bad Machinery as basically the number one David Harper comic because it just feels the most like me in my own brain. So there's that. And then last, Kate Beaton, very tough omission. I love Kate Beaton's work. And yeah, it's just tough list to make. So the three that do make it, my all-time three, one of the crucial distinctions here, this isn't based off an original art standpoint. This is just based off of the work that I really love. One of the three is Jeff Smith, unsurprisingly, because Jeff Smith is probably, Bone is a top 5 all-time comic for me. And Jeff Smith's work, it was extremely meaningful to me throughout my entire life. I absolutely love his work. Another one is Faith Erin Hicks. Faith Erin Hicks is probably consistently the comic creator whose work I love the most. I love everything she's ever done. Her character acting is so elite, as I've said so many times. I just really appreciate her work in all capacities. And it's just great stuff. It's just fantastic. I know that maybe some would point to like a Mike Mignola or like a Frank Miller or something like that, but this is my thing. So that's what we got. And then last, we have the writer artist behind my 1B to Preachers 1A for my favorite comic all time, 20th Century Boys, Naoki Urasawa. I absolutely love his work. I love pretty much everything he's ever done. I love Pluto. I love Master Keaton. I love Monster, etc., etc. 20th Century Boys is my favorite, but basically anything Urasawa does is just absolutely unbelievable. So that would be my top three. That leaves out a tremendous amount of names, many of whom are absolute masters of the craft. But again, this is my list, and that's what I got. And before we get to the next question, let's take a quick break to say hey to one of off-panel sponsors. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Bad Idea is back, and they're bringing their biggest book yet, Megalith. Megalith is an epic of unparalleled detail and artistry. It's the result of a mammoth 5-year production journey where no expense was spared, and a monument such as this demands an equally worthy presentation, and Bad Idea needs your help to make that a reality. In 2018, Matt Kint and Louis LaRosa set to create a comic book without the constraints of time and with an unrivaled budget. Joined by electric colorist Laura Martin and veteran letterer Taylor Esposito, what resulted from their efforts is an event comic unlike any before it. The comic book only known by its code name, Megalith. A comic book of such breathtaking beauty that it needs to be seen to be believed. This magnum opus of bad ideas hitting Kickstarter soon, with this crowdfunding effort focused on promoting the release into comic shops. So if you're a comic shop and you want Megalith in your stores, keep an eye on Kickstarter for just that. And now, back to the show.
Hey David, this is Scott Hazelwood from Portland, Oregon. Congratulations on 400 episodes of Off Panel. I'm wondering, since you've been doing the show for so long, what do you think has changed more, the comic book industry or Major League Baseball? Again, thanks for the show. It's great. I look forward to it every week. And congratulations on 400 episodes.
I just want to say really quick, shouts to Scott. Scott is one of the most loyal listeners of the podcast and supporters of everything I do. So big thanks to him for dropping a question in here. But this one is pretty easy. As much as it might feel like comics has changed, and comics have changed over the 8 years I've been doing this, most of the change has been a shift in what's selling the most, I guess. And manga has taken a big bump up. The book market has taken a big bump up. But those things existed before. The direct market really hasn't changed too much. The Marvel and DC still dominate it. Scholastic still is at the top of the charts over in the book market, along with Viz. That's not exactly new. There are changes, and there continues to be change, like Comixology imploded and the digital market is totally torn asunder, and there's new distribution, et cetera, et cetera. But Major League Baseball has changed way more. Major League Baseball has added a universal designated hitter. They've added more playoff teams. They've added a pitch clock, which is like completely changed the game, chopping huge amounts of time out. They've added larger bases, all these different things. I mean, as soon as they switch to robo-umps, the people who really hate change in baseball are going to lose their mind because it's completely changed the game. Oh, they banned the shift too, which is great. After the shift became a thing, it's astonishing how much Major League Baseball has changed. It still looks the same in the same way that comics looks the same, but they've made more meaningful change to try to shorten games and enhance the overall experience. Have they totally succeeded? Absolutely not. Just like comics has not totally succeeded, but they're trying, and effort is half the battle, right?
Hey, David, it's John Suntress from the Word Balloon Podcast. Congratulations on 400 episodes. That's fantastic. I have a question for you, and it's been bugging me. I wonder what your opinion is. I am worried about the price point of the $5 20-page comic. You know, as they say, the rent is too high. I don't think it's feasible, and I really worry about what the plan is. I know that both companies, DC and Marvel in particular, have experimented with, kind of longer books for a higher price point. But I don't know, man. I worry about that $5 price on a 20-page magazine. What are your thoughts?
I'll be honest, I actually asked John if he would submit a question just because John is the podfather, John Suntress from Word Balloon. He is one of the first podcasters to ever do it, and basically he is the measuring stick of which Off Panel is compared to. And if anyone ever compares me favorably, it's a very kind thing for them to say to me because, I mean, he's been doing it for so long and he's so respected in the industry. Anyways, to his question, the $5 comic, I mean, $5, to be honest, is like sometimes a nice change of pace relative to the higher prices at this point. Overall, there's like two different perspectives I have on this. One, there's my own perspective. $4.99 or higher does impact it will impact the comics that I buy. I have to really, really want to buy that comic if I'm going to spend $4.99 on it or higher. And that has created a little bit more friction in terms of my consumer experience. And it's created a situation where sometimes I'll pass on things that I'm on the fence on just because it's a little higher price than I'd like it to be. That's a bit difficult because I know that in this day and age, it's gotten more expensive to print things. It's gotten more expensive to ship things. It's gotten more expensive to do everything. And so higher price points are more understandable than they had been in the past. But at the same time, as a consumer, it does make it a little bit more difficult. That said, from the other side of my brain, the business side of the brain, I've talked to retailers who have said that they've been kind of ready for a price increase for a while because certain books you could charge more for it and people would still buy it, which means that they're going to make more money on it, which means publishers are going to make more money on it, which means creators aren't necessarily going to make more money on it because that's how comics works. And that's terrible. That's just the truth, though. It's just I don't think that an increased price point is going to make a significant difference in orders. And I don't think it's going to make a significant difference in terms of what people are buying in terms of single issues, at least in part because single issues are so niche at this point and they're not really a price point driven product. To be honest, it's like a lot of collectors will spend extra money to get a specific cover. So $4.99 for a single issue is not exactly imposing when you're used to buying 1 in 25, 1 in 50, or like 1 in 100 variants and things of that sort. So I don't think it's going to make a massive difference. In fact, I really think that $4.99 will become the regular price point within the next, year, if it's not already pretty much there. And so I don't love it, but I understand it. And I expect it to become the norm sooner rather than later. So we probably need to get prepared for it, even if no comic fan really wants it.
Hi, my name is Tjaž from Slovenia. And since discovering your podcast and website last year, I haven't missed a single episode or article. Now my question is, do you keep a list of comics you've read? I tend to dip in and out of the big two books, so I quickly forget where I left off. Also, do you have a list of comics you would someday like to read? I know you've mentioned Sandman a few times. So how long would you keep a comic on your to-read list before deciding you'll probably never get around to it? Thank you so much for all your work.
I'm actually going to do a 2-for-1 special here. And a listener named Ben actually asked a question about basically when am I going to get around to reading Love and Rockets and Sandman, because those seem like pretty big gaps. They absolutely are massive gaps. They are on a list that I have that matches the other question from Joss. Those are basically the totality of my to-read list. I don't really keep formal lists in a true sense. I have books that I know I want to read, like Sandman is on there, Love and Rockets, which I now own. I have I have the first 40 chapters of Love and Rockets. So I am ready to read that. I just have to find time. To be honest, the main problem with getting through my to-read list is a combination of the fact that digging into the past is a little bit more difficult to do when I'm constantly trying to stay focused on the present for the site and podcast. And not to boil it down to utility, but it's not as useful for me to look back on things, even though I actually have columns that are designed to do just that. So maybe what I need to do is I just need to make it a task for myself to read Sandman and to read Love and Rockets so I can actually write about it and be like, hey, it turns out people are right. These comics are really good. And so the ultimate point, though, is I need to do that. I will say, involving Love and Rockets, I actually have read Death to Speedy because Cliff Chang had me read it for one of the columns I do with on Sketched. It's the comics that made them. And you know what? It turns out Love and Rockets is incredible. So that incentivizes me even more. But in terms of keeping a list of comics that I have read, I have no such thing. As much as I love lists, I don't really have any formal reading approach. I don't have a list of things that I have read. I don't have a list of things that I want to read. It's all very feel based. Besides, actually the poll on Wednesdays when I write about the comics that I'm buying, that's basically the closest I get to having a to read list, and it's mostly just for the website. The funny thing is on weeks that I don't do that list, I actually completely forget what I'm going to buy, and so I actually use the poll as my own guide for things I'm buying when I go into the comic shop. But long story short, I have a lot of comics I need to read. I will keep it on there forever because I know I need to. There are a number of other comics that are on that list that I know I need to get to. Like, for example, Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa. I have a hardcover collection of that. I want to read it. Still haven't gotten to it. There's a ton of manga I want to get to. Haven't read it. Still need to get to it. But that's kind of the problem with the world of entertainment today. We just have so much we can possibly choose from. It's less about cost and less about desire, and it's more about, do we have the time to engage with all these things? And that's my excuse. I just don't have time. I'm sorry. I will get to it at some point. I know I'm terrible for not reading Love and Rockets and not reading Sandman. At some point I will do it, and I will let you all know just how spectacular the experience was, because I'm sure it will be. I hear good things.
Hello, David. Multiple off-panel guest, Declan Shalvey here. I was curious, in all the 400 episodes you've done now, what is the most surprising thing you've learned about comics from the creative side, from your interviews, and also the business side, because you cover that so much? Can you think of like one thing that you were like, that is like mind-boggling to me. I didn't know that before. And congratulations. I'm delighted for you. It's one of my favorite podcasts. May you do 400 plus more. Bye.
So mind-boggling is probably the tricky part about this one, because I don't know what I've learned that was truly mind-boggling. I will say that there are things that I've learned that I've been a little surprised by, or at least like surprised by the totality of, or like things that I've been surprised by from my position as a reader. And I would say from the creative side, one of the big things for me is I've been surprised by really just how much editors do. I've really come to respect the great ones. It's an extremely underrated position. I've said this many times on the podcast before. I really think it's a shame that editors are brought up seemingly mostly when they've failed rather than when they've succeeded, because they contribute a lot to the ideas and the creative decisions of comics. And that's a really important thing. From the business side, I was trying to think of a way to make this sound less mean or rude, but it just kind of is what it is. One of the things that surprises me the most, and probably the closest I get to being, truly mind-boggled by all of this, is just how stupid some of the business stuff is, and just how, I don't want to say nefarious, but it's just a lot of weird decisions that are made, and a lot of decisions that are just, I guess, mind-boggling. I guess that's the way I would put it. Also, how so much of the business side is trying to free yourself from that as a creator. It seems like the longer you go, it's like the goal becomes, how do I extricate myself from the bad decisions and the bad moves that are often made within this industry? That's not universal, but it's a thing that happens, and it's very strange. I do want to add one layer to this that Declan didn't ask about, though. In terms of the things that surprised me the most about podcasting in specific, there's two things that I want to bring up. One of the things is that I've been doing it long enough that I've actually forgotten entire episodes, that is truly mind-boggling. I was going through the list for this question, and there was somewhere I was just like, I remember talking to that person before, but I don't remember talking to them for the podcast. I think part of the problem is I do so many interviews outside of podcasting that they kind of bleed together. And the other thing about podcasting that I think is really interesting is that I learned a lot on the fly. And one of the things that I expected is that in some ways it would be really easy, but in a lot of ways that I didn't expect it would be really hard. Like there's no way you can really shortcut editing. That's just a thing you have to do and it's going to take time. And then in regards to guests, one of the things that's been a pleasant surprise is that a lot of times the bigger the guest, the more I get nervous, but then the nicer that person is. I've been truly just thrilled by sometimes when I get some like legends on the podcast and I'm horribly nervous and I'm expecting the worst to happen because I'm just going to have I'm just going to go Chris Farley show as I put it. And they always put me at ease because they're super chill. Anyways, those are 3 layers of most surprising things. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, Declan, but I think that's in the vein. So there you go.
Hi, David. It's John Auerbach. Congrats on Off Panel's 400th episode. Your piece on your recent trip to France and how the different comic formats there are designed to make it easy for new readers to jump in got me thinking. Do you think we will see the big two try something radically different to the current single-issue format? I remember Jonathan Hickman throwing out the idea of doing a Shonen Jump style book that collected all the X-Men titles for that particular month, and that was designed to be affordable and read once. Will we ever see something like that?
It's a great question, and it's a really important one just because the industry is shifting and the traditional single issue format isn't necessarily the way forward, or at least it doesn't seem to be. There's a couple layers of answers to this, though, just because there's time frames to all this. Will they ever try other things? Yes, absolutely. I mean, they already have. There's been anthologies throughout the years. There's one-shots, there's annuals, there's all these different things. They do regular different things in terms of shifting the single issue format into something different. Even now, DC is adding the backups to a lot of their books and having a higher cover price. That's a thing that they're doing. It's not radically different, but it is slightly different. In terms of more of a Shonen Jump style thing, like the thing that Hickman had talked about previously on the podcast, that would be a great thing to see, especially if they did like a digital version that was low cost, sort of like Shonen Jump actually does, or like Viz Manga actually does. But that unfortunately is not really their typical prerogative because they're trying to make as much money as possible because they're owned by Disney and Warner Brothers. And it's understandable that they're trying to maximize revenue, and having low cost point products is not a really good way to get that, unless it leads to more consumers, which is less reliable than just trusting that the existing ones will be there. Plus, when it comes to the digital side, they're not really motivated to do that, the Viz Manga or Shonen Jump style product, just because they already have Marvel Unlimited and people already signed up for it. So why would they decrease the cost? They wouldn't. And so they probably won't. And the odds on a print product coming out that's Shonen Jump like seems unlikely. So Ever, I think that the length of Ever is very long, and the odds are great that at some point they will do something radically different just because single issues cannot last forever. I don't think, because it's going to age out along with all the people who love that sort of medium. Do I think it's going to happen soon? Maybe not. Probably not. Almost certainly not. We're not very big on that. Change does not happen quick in the direct market with the big two and all that. I think Tom Muller once put it on the podcast that smaller publishers are speedboats and Marvel and DC are oil tankers, and it takes them a long time to turn. I think that's really true. But I do think the shift is on, and at some point, I think we're going to see them playing more with formats because they kind of have to, unless they just abandon the, direct market completely. So, I mean, we are seeing them do more with graphic novels. With Marvel, the weird thing is they're doing that through other publishers, like Scholastic Graphics doing young reader graphic novels, and Marvel Arts over at Abrams Comic Arts doing the more art book style ones. But at the same time, they're trying different things over there. So the interest is there. We'll see when they get there. I don't know.
Hi, David. This is Patrick Coyle. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. And my question is how? How do you stay motivated? How do you keep doing this? You have the site, you have off-panel, you have a day job, you have a life, you have a wife. How do you stay on top of it? How do you get yourself to do this all the time, every week, day in, day out? I ask because I have my own creative endeavors and I struggle with this. And so I'm just curious to hear what your answer is. Thanks.
I get this question a lot, Patrick, and it's a very reasonable question because I do a lot. I have my day job where I work in an advertising agency as vice president of digital. I have all of my comic stuff sketched off panel. I do freelance stuff for like Publishers Weekly and varying other platforms on occasion. I have a number of other things I do. I have my wife, I have my family, I have my cats, etc., etc. It's a lot. I'm not going to pretend like it's not a lot. And I'm also not going to pretend like I have any secret that anyone should really know or could replicate. So I've come up with a shortcut to the 4 reasons why I'm able to manage this. I call it the 4 Fs. The first F is I'm fast. I'm very fast. I always tell people that a lot of the things that people struggle to write, I, for some reason, don't have to. I don't know why. I've talked to writers about this before, particularly Jeff Lemire, where he really saw where I was coming from, where I feel like I'm always writing in my head. So when I sit down to write like a 5,000 word article, it can take me an hour and a half because it's just basically I'm a stenographer for my own ideas. It really doesn't take me too long. Editing takes more time, but I'm pretty quick at it. Another one is I'm flexible, or actually more specifically, my life is flexible. Basically, I've spent years doing everything I can to make my job as flexible as possible. And so everyone is very understanding of my schedule, and I just kind of am able to make everything work because I've built flexibility into it and because I'm flexible myself with scheduling. That is necessary because I live in Alaska, and it turns out it's very difficult to schedule people when you do a podcast in Alaska sometimes. So you got to be like that. Another one is I'm fortunate. That's the very important F. Everyone in my life is very supportive, particularly my wife. Amber is amazing and is always understanding of my needs and never complains about any of it and realizes I have a lot of stuff to do, but I also really love it. And she supports that, which is fantastic. And the last F is I'm foolish. I think that I can take on a lot more than I probably can. And so I do. And that becomes a lot and overwhelming, and I make it work, but sometimes it feels like I'm burning the candle at both ends and then inventing new ends that I'm burning. And it can be just ridiculous and overwhelming. But I guess that would be the 5th F. I haven't thought of what the 5th F would be, but it's just, I guess, fake. Let's say fake. You got to hide it because like sometimes you get stressed out and you don't want everyone to know it all the time. So, sometimes I might make it look easy. It's not always easy. It's rarely easy, but I make it work because I love it. And in regards to your question about like, how do I stay motivated? That is a struggle at times. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed. Sometimes I think about quitting. I often think about quitting. I mean, I've had this vision in my head that I would quit like Forrest Gump when he's on his long distance run across the country and he keeps running back and forth. And one day he just says like, I don't even remember what he says, but basically it's just like, I think I'm going to stop now or something like that. And that's just what I would do. I'm not saying that I'm anywhere near that, but I've had that thought. And I think anybody who does this stuff, especially solo act type stuff, has had that thought just because it's a lot. And the part of the way I get through this is I give myself breaks. I've gotten a lot better about if I just don't have 1 week, I would just take a week off or take a month off. I've taken the last couple of Junes off. I just took April off. Because of the way that my structure works, I can pre-plan on the podcast and I can set up Sketch so everyone gets a free month or a free week or whatever. So they don't have to pay for something I'm not producing. And so it works. And thankfully to all the subscribers and patrons out there, I almost never lose anyone. And quite often I gain people, which is bewildering. And beyond that, it's like on some weeks, it's like I try to have a piece of, an article or a feature or a podcast Monday through Friday. And if I don't have that, if I don't have something on one of those days, then I just don't have it. And I just dial it back for the week. And that's that. And, maybe some people are like, where's this Thursday article? But if I can't do it, I can't force myself to do it. And if I force myself to do it, it would just break me. And I just can't do it. To be honest, the main struggle for me is, I would call it filling the ideal well. It's just, I can write and write and write, but coming up with new things to write about and new ways to approach different stories can be the biggest struggle. I always have a notebook or an email thread or something that's being filled with these things. But to be honest, I've tackled so many big subjects and done so many big interviews that it can be kind of hard to keep thinking new ways to approach things that fit within the knowledge base I have and the abilities to reach people that I have. Because to be honest, I know how I've had a lot of people who ask me, like, how do you get the people you get on the podcast? The answer is I ask and I'm willing to hear no. I've had hundreds of no's, hundreds. I've had hundreds of no responses. And the only way to get to a yes is by continuing to go through that. And the only way to continue to, make good ideas is to be fine with making some bad ideas every once in a while. So I don't know if there's anything actionable on that. There probably isn't, but I think that the core of it, though, is I really love what I do. I'm a very curious person by nature. I love comics. And if I didn't have those things, it would all fall apart. And also I have a very supportive wife and vaguely understanding cats.
Hello, David. It's Patrick Coyle here again. I was wondering if you had considered taking on a partner for your work, whether it's for off-panel or for Sketched, considering the workload that you have. It just seems insane to me that you do it all yourself. I love it all. I hope you continue to do it, but I'm just wondering if that's something you've ever considered. Thanks.
I would say that I actually do have partners. You might not see them. It's understandable that you don't because they're kind of in the background. I mean, one obvious one is my wife, Amber. She helps with a lot of different things. Like she does my podcast headers and she does all the design for Sketchbook 2022. And we go to cons. She helps out a ton there. Amber is the secret MVP of the website. And if I didn't have her, I would be a complete disaster just in life. So, and she also just makes my life easier. It's like if I didn't have that, then it would be really difficult to manage all of this. That's having an amazing partner in life helps a lot with, the website in ways that you wouldn't necessarily realize. And then also on the editing front of the podcast, I often work with an independent editor named Deanna Chapman who helps a ton. And on weeks where I'm just totally slammed, I'll pass it over to Deanna and Deanna knocks out a really nice edit. I'll go through it again, but it makes my life so much easier and it makes the podcast so much better. And that's one of the things is a lot of what I do with what I do earn off of Sketch and Off Panel just goes right back into producing the website and producing the podcast and making it work to its absolute best. So having partners is a good thing. In regards to the website in specific, though, early on when I was doing Sketch 2.0, I was starting to have other writers write for the site and I was paying them and they were writing some great stuff. But the thing was, it was getting a lot bigger than I wanted. And more than that, it wasn't really matching my goals. I never wanted to make another site, like a big site. I never wanted to be CBR or like Newsarama or something like that, or even like Popverse or The Beat. I just wanted to be me. And I just wanted to do a website that matched my interests. And managing the people and trying to keep an overall look at what the site was started becoming pretty unwieldy. And it was just, I wasn't enjoying it. And I really liked paying people and I really liked supporting great writing. But with everything else, adding the boss on top of it was making things really challenging. And to be honest, I'm just not a good boss. I'm not really good at organizing things in a way that extends beyond my person. And so it didn't make sense. So I think in a weird way, beyond the partners I mentioned early on and other partners I work with, like David Kelly's helped at cons before and he's totally amazing. Besides those things, one of the keys is just keeping Sketch and Off Panel at a reasonable size that I can accomplish. I've had people ask me like, oh, would you ever be interested in doing this full time or making more articles or doing things like that? And maybe. But at the same time, in the current state, this is basically my absolute maximum. And I know it is a lot, and I act like it isn't a lot sometimes, but I think this is the only way I can handle it is by keeping it at a reasonable size for what I'm doing and keeping it within the realms of what I can handle without like basically totally falling apart. And I've managed to do that, which is great. Okay, the next question comes from writer James Tynan IV. He does not introduce himself, but I just want to give you a heads up before we get into it.
If you could choose one of the original 5 X-Men just to cease existing, so they have never existed in the entire history of the Marvel canon, which would it be?
I love this question because it is one of the rare questions I receive that is just straight up comic shop fodder where you discuss it and maybe get into arguments and fisticuffs or something if you said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person. It's the classic Wednesday Warrior discussion point. It also is actually really easy in my opinion. And I know some would very, very, very strongly disagree with this idea. I think all 5 of the characters are great. I think they all have their merits. I just think the path to this solution is really obvious, at least from my subjective point of view, because that's the thing about the X-Men. X-Men more than maybe any other set of characters, are incredibly subjective because there's so many of them and everyone has their favorites. But let's break it down by who you obviously can't cut. The two most obvious ones are Cyclops and Jean Grey. You cannot cut them, just straight up. They are protected. They're too important. Cyclops is one of the two most important characters, one most important characters in the history of the X-Men. I don't even know. He is, let's say, at least top 3, certainly top 5. So you can't cut him. Jean Grey, obviously, was always a backbone character to the entire story. And if you cut her out, even though she is cut out for great lengths of time because she's dead, even when she's gone, she's a part of the story. So you just can't cut her. So that makes it Angel, Beast, or Iceman. That just really gets down to subjectivity. My opinion of the 5, my favorite character of the 5 is Bobby. I love Bobby Drake. Iceman's amazing. His power set's incredible. I brought this up to a pal of mine and I said that Bobby is probably my favorite and I love his powers. And he pointed out that it took Emma Frost going in his body to really make him realize that he could do big things. And I'm like, yeah, sure. That's great. I mean, who among us hasn't realized our own potential and needed somebody else to point it out? It's very relatable by Bobby. Beast, I've loved Beast in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different forms. He has the greatest spectrum of, greatest spectrum of good to bad, but I think Cyclops probably hasn't beat there. But I always find him to be incredibly interesting. I think there's a reason why whenever there's like an all-star team version of the X-Men, he's always back on it. He's really likable. He's also one of the only characters that kind of jumps into the other teams pretty easily, and it's because he's a great character. That leaves Angel. Angel's my cut. I like Warren Worthington III. I like Archangel. I like all these different things, but he's the obvious cut. Sorry, Warren, you're out. 05, you never existed. Peace, Warren. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. May is lining up to be one of the biggest months ever for Zoop. It's going to feature campaign launches for the Stardust anthology spearheaded by Van Jensen, Jason Copeland's powerhouse Full Tilt, Shannon K. Garrity's Skin Horse, Luciano Vecchio's Sereno, and an art book by the one and only Jorge Molina. Not only that, but you still have time to support Mark Nelson's Thunder Hunters and rising superstar Marco Fontanilli. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, the creators appreciate your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show.
Hi, Dave. Congrats on your 400th episodes and whoop-de-doo. But actually, I want to hear from Amber, not from you. And Amber, my question is, as someone outside of the comics, what's your take on the people that you met through the years, being with Dave and this entire crazy industry that you've been seeing as an outsider for so long? Has there been something that really surprised you? Has there been something that really made you go, it's actually much cooler than I thought it was? Or was there something that made you go, wow, this is worse than I thought it was going to be? Thank you.
That was Bruno Batista from Big Bang Comics. He doesn't want to hear from me, though. This is Amber's time. Amber, my wife. Amber, take it away.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. So coming into this relationship with David and meeting a lot of different comic people, I didn't really have any preconceived ideas about people or the industry or artists or writers. The comic world was completely new to me. But what wasn't new was just being around artists, having a background in architecture, and just taking a number of art classes through school and being around drama kids and all that kind of stuff. Like, I'm used to being around artist types. So what was, I guess, interesting was to come with that idea of just art and expression and seeing it done in a different way and how people have made that into a business, just as kind of architecture is a way of, being an artist, but making it work and not being a starving artist of some sort. But it's been very cool, and it's been very cool to see people living their dreams and coming up with so many really creative ideas and just seeing all the different types of art and realizing that comics aren't just superhero comics, because I guess that would be one idea I kind of came in with, was just, oh, comics are superheroes. And, realizing that that's not the case, that everything can be told through the comic medium. And that's been really refreshing to see, that all these different aspects that I didn't realize before, and how much thought goes into that, and just being kind of behind the scenes on the storytelling and the industry itself is really interesting to me. And so when people preface dinners, like, I'm sorry, Amber, this is going to be a comic sort of dinner, and I'm sorry you have to be here with us. I really don't mind, because it's interesting to me. So I don't feel left out or bored by any of it whatsoever. And the people that I've met are very interesting and well-rounded, and they have such interesting stories to tell. They're from all walks of different life. They're always really funny, which is refreshing too, to not be sitting around at like a stodgy sort of business type of interaction with people. And, they're also really inspiring, doing what they love, whether it's art, writing, even just from a business standpoint. Like, everyone's very passionate, and I feel like that's inspiring to me, to still find that people being very passionate about what they do and very hardworking, and not just giving up or anything like that. And I think it's great.
Thank you to Amber, and thank you to Bruno for asking the question. Up next, we have a question from writer Kieran Gillen, who, if you've been listening to the podcast, you probably could have guessed this was him. But here he is.
David. Now, it's been a while since I was in the trenches writing about pop culture, but for all my ludicrous ego, there was one thing I didn't do. Or at least, I didn't do it often. That is, pontificate about what people should be doing. I figured it was arrogant when I didn't really know what was going on behind various curtains, and I'd just be revealing my ignorance. I mean, backseat quarterbacking is just nonsense. I mean, you can't throw footballs from the back seat for a start. Okay, I'm going to ask you to ignore all that. What's the one thing that no one's doing, or at least not enough people are doing, that you think they should be doing? I ask this so I can rip it off.
So the truth is, journalist Kieran has a lot in common with journalist David. I am very much not prone to telling people what to do, to the point where a lot of my articles I try to leave kind of open-ended, because I don't want to tell people what to do, because I don't typically know all of their circumstances. But I've been asked to do this, and so I'm going to do it. So if there's one thing no one's doing, or not enough people are doing, that they should, it's probably putting Stilt-Man in more comics. But if there's two things that they're not doing, or not enough people are doing, my answer is going to focus on the business side of things, because I can't tell people what to write or draw or anything like that. I think my answer is creators should bet on themselves more. What I mean by that is, when possible, I think the mechanics are there to wildly succeed without publishers, or at the very least to succeed with publishers, but also doing your own thing. The thing about it is there's mechanics like Kickstarter and Patreon and all these different things where you can kind of leverage these tools and get more value out of the comics that you make. A good example of this is there's this recent wave of art books that have been hitting from top artists. For example, Arthur Adams is doing one right now, and it's like in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the thing is I don't think enough creators are doing things like that, where they take pre-existing material or supplementary material or varying things of that sort and making more out of it and turning it into things that their fans would love. And the funny thing is I love that Kieran asked this question, because I actually think The Wicked and the Divine would have been perfect for this environment, because its fans are incredibly passionate about it, and they were incredibly passionate during it, to the point where when the book ended, they had a wake for the book and the characters at New York Comic Con, which is insanely awesome. And that was several years ago, and I have to say, I think people want more depth with their fandoms, or from their fandoms, than ever before. I think creators can get more out of what they make. And I think that there's a real opportunity. Like if you were doing Wicdiv, you can do a behind the scenes book on how that was made, or you can do like a character, like a design book from Jamie, where you're getting into the weeds as to how Jamie designed all these characters, these iconic characters that everyone loves. You can do more things like the magazine issue where it was, profile pieces on the varying characters done in universe. I think that there's so much room for experimentation with that type of stuff and exploring these sides that are not traditional comic books that I think people would love because they love these things. They want more depth from it. They want to dig deeper into the things that they love. And I don't know if that's always touched on. Like, that's why it's encouraging to see all those art books, because like if Stuart Immonen did an art book tomorrow and it was just about birds, I would buy that in a second. And I know he's done art books, but I mean, if he kickstarted one, it would be over instantaneously. And I think there'd be a ton more people who do that. And I do think it's important to note that this is not necessarily possible for everyone, and it's not necessarily for everyone. I think that it's easy to say you should bet on yourself when you already have a significant audience behind you, and not everyone has that. And then more than that, if you're doing Kickstarters or you're doing crowdfunding based things, or if you're doing things that are just way outside the box in terms of how you approach comics typically, not everyone has the organizational skills and the perspective and the desire to do these sort of things. But at the same time, I just think that given the direct market environment and given how unreliable some of the publishers have become and given how unreliable the larger market has become, I think it's important for creators to find solutions that are outside the typical norms, find things that work for them, and think outside the box when it comes to what you do, because your fans' love isn't going to stop with the comics. And you can inspire more love, and you can have a higher ceiling for yourself as a creator, as a person who's trying to do this as a living, by leveraging that. And it's going to make everyone enjoy it more, and it's going to work better for you. Again, not for everyone, but I really think that there's a lot of meat on the bone for creators who are looking for different solutions. And I think we're going to start seeing that. I think we're already seeing that, but I think we've just scratched the surface on this. I think there's a lot more there. I think there's a lot more room to explore, and I can't wait to see creators do this. And also, I do want to note, I noted that this is mostly something for creators that already have some sort of following, but I think that there's a lot of creators who've done amazing things that have built up a lot of support and have managed to have a lot of success doing these sort of things without having that A-list creator level success. And I think some of the most exciting stuff will come from people who aren't looking at comics in a traditional sense and are trying to find new answers because of it. So it's anyone's game, and I can't wait to see what people come up with when they really start betting on themselves. All right, one last question, and then that's the end of Off Panel number 400.
Hey, David. Hey, Off Panel Podcast. It's Botter from the Short Box Podcast, calling in to congratulate you on a huge milestone. 400 episodes is major, or major, as the French would say. That is something to be tremendously proud of. And I've always said you have to calculate podcast years like dog years, because so much time goes into one episode, much less running an entire independent podcast. So I tip my hat off to you, David. And as a fellow podcaster, I'm curious to hear what episodes or interviews come to mind when you think of having the most impact on the way you view comics or the industry. Does a moment or memory stick out that really changed your outlook on the medium for better or worse? And your basketball tweets are some of my favorite things to read on Twitter. Have you read the manga Slam Dunk? I recently started it because of a suggestion from Chris from Comic Tropes. And if you haven't read it, I think it's fantastic. I think you'd like it. That's all I got for you. Once again, congrats on the milestone, and thank you for what you do. Peace.
We'll start with the easy one. I have the first volume of Slam Dunk. I have not read it. I really should, given the fact that I constantly clamor for wanting more sports comics. And yet I own one, and I have not read it because I'm the world's greatest monster. I mean, as many comic fans know, the key to being a comic fan is to collect a lot of them and read some of them. And I am living up to my identity as a comic fan. Anyways, so to the real question, the episodes that most impacted how I view comics or the industry. The obvious answer is the right answer. The very first episode I did, which was on the business of comics with artist Sean Gordon Murphy, or I guess writer-artist Sean Gordon Murphy, was an eye-opener on several different levels. First off, it is, I believe, to this day, my most listened to podcast, unless my first House of X, Powers of 10 episode of Off Panel with Jonathan Hickman surpassed it, which is entirely possible because Jonathan Hickman is very, very, very good at driving downloads, especially when he's writing the X-Men. But that episode was tremendously eye-opening because it was going from never having done a podcast to having a podcast that was 80th in the world in total download, or in Apple Podcasts algorithms for that day. And it was very overwhelming and it was really cool. But in the process, I learned a lot about how the comic industry really works. I learned about how people respond when you're very honest about your opinions. I learned a lot about just everything. And it was basically the most intense and perfect first episode I possibly could have had. In terms of the other episodes, I went through my entire list of podcasts that I've done. And while this is not comprehensive, I do want to note several of them as like key ones that I learned from. Some of them it's obvious. My 13th episode, I had editor Sebastian Gerner on the podcast, and Sebastian is amazing, but also Sebastian is an editor. And it was the first time I'd really talked to an editor about how the job of an editor really works. Similarly, I had Tom Moeller, the designer, on with my 22nd episode, and that was extremely enlightening in terms of the process of designing, but also really just how like design is looked at from his perspective in comics. And that was really helpful. Episode 25 had Jim Demonakos on, the person who founded Emerald City Comic Con and worked for Reed Pop, I believe, at the time. And we talked about how conventions work and how all of it came together and how he built a convention. And I know a lot about comics, but I knew nothing about that. That was very fascinating. Another one that fits this bill, episode 79, Caitlin D'Amata, who is a comics lawyer who works with people for contracts and varying things like that. Caitlin came on and took me to school in terms of how all that stuff worked. These episodes, these ones in this sort of vein where I just have somebody on and I learn about how things work from a perspective that's completely different than my own. Deb Aoki, recent one, manga journalist, that's another really great example. Those are just really eye-opening because I don't know these things, and I'm asking these people because they do, and it helps me understand comics way better. In terms of more regular guests or more regular types of guests, every time I have a retailer on, I feel like I learn a lot, not the least of which is just really how different every retailer is, which is incredibly different. And I feel like every time I have Daniel Warren Johnson on, it's very informative because Daniel views art and story in such a uniquely Daniel sort of way. And having him on to talk about his work, but also just art in general, is both very exciting and it builds my own enthusiasm, but also it's like educational. It really helps. And lastly, I would say this isn't really how it didn't impact how I view comics or the industry, but every time I have Jonathan Hickman on, I feel like it makes me a better podcaster. And it makes me better at asking questions, and it makes me better at thinking through the narratives of my podcast, because I don't know if it's clear, but whenever I do an episode, I don't just think of what questions do I want to ask. I think of what story I want to tell on the podcast and how I want to approach it, how I want to organize it and everything like that. And the thing about Hickman is he's going to keep you on your toes, and he's going to make you bring your A game. And every time he comes on, whether we're talking Three Worlds, Three Moons, we're talking East of West, we're talking the X-Men, whatever. Whenever he's on, I feel like I have to bring my A game because he is going to expect that out of me, and he's going to, he wants to have a good experience. And so I put a lot of pressure on myself. And so I learn a lot about myself. I learn a lot about podcasting. And I learn a lot about comics when I talk to Jonathan too, because Jonathan is incredibly honest and he has his own view on how to do things. And needless to say, he's been very successful with that view. And that's inspiring. That's really cool. It is horrifying when I get on there with him because I always feel like there's like a trick around the corner. And I always know he notices things, and it's, I don't like it when he notices things because I'm like, how did you notice that? And I'm like, of course he did. You're Hickman. That's what you do. Yeah, so those would be probably my answers. I learned something new in every podcast, though, and that's by design. My podcasts are designed to be an experience where I answer questions that are in my head. And the second I run out of questions, or the second I stop being curious about this, will probably be when Off Panel and Sketched finish, because I'm done. I'm just done like Forrest Gump, and I just stopped running, and that's how it'd be. This isn't the end of Off Panel, though. Off Panel's got a long ways to go. It is the end of this episode, though, and here's to episode 500. Still to come, 100 episodes from now. Jim Lee, please come on the podcast. And here is to everyone who listens, and everyone who submitted a question, and everyone who supports the show in varying ways. I really, really, really appreciate it. You're all the best. Until next week, this is David Harper, signing off. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with me. 400 episodes. It's so crazy I had myself as the guest. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Scott Place, Darcy Van Polgeest, Kevin Bides, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Del Rey, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Eurotam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Ron V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Corin, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandevan, Brian, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Philip Myrick, Chris Bachala, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Ta, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outros, the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote, performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.